Hello and thanks for joining us at interest.co.nz. I'm Janae Tibshirani and today my guest is Labour's housing spokesperson, Megan Woods. Thank you for your time.
Good morning and wonderful to be here, Janae.
The country's median house price has increased by 25% since Labour has been in government. This is the same percentage increase as during the previous National-led government's 3-year term. What is actually Labour's policy when it comes to house prices? Where would you like to see them?
Well, I think one of the things that we have to keep on doing is making sure that we're adding to the affordable supply in the market. One of the things that I think that Kiwibuild has been able to demonstrate that there is demand and plenty of demand for affordable housing without radically readjusting house prices and people losing equity in their homes, that there is plenty of room for those affordable houses at that end of the market. And I think one of the interesting things that we've seen over the last 3 years is that we are seeing developers start to deliver market homes at those more affordable prices too. So in terms of what our policy is, it's to keep on adding and to make sure that we are still having activity at the affordable end of the market, and we don't see what we saw post GFC, where we saw developers retreat into the safest part of the market, which is the more expensive, less dense housing.
Okay, losing equity, I mean, that is of course the concern because that then affects the entire banking system, confidence, and as we know, banks are so exposed to mortgages. So that is a fair concern when it comes to decreases. But some people will say, well, look, when they've been increasing at such huge levels, would it really matter if people lost a wee bit of equity and that meant a whole bunch of other people could come into the market?
Well, certainly what we want to see is some stabilization of prices. The kind of growth we're seeing, I think everybody would agree, is a huge impediment to people getting into the housing market. And that's why that delivering at that affordable end of the market, which really had been underserviced over previous years, is such an important part and a really important piece of the puzzle of housing affordability.
Okay, look, we'll come back to Kiwibuild a little later. I just wanted to ask you, you have in this term of government sort of been the fix-it minister, brought in at times where things needed fixing, but can you really fundamentally fix the housing market, I guess the price growth, when what you're doing is kind of working against what the Reserve Bank is doing in terms of lowering interest rates and trying to encourage borrowing and investing and spending, and this is largely coming through the housing market. Can you really stabilise those house prices when the RBNZ is doing something quite different?
Well, I think there's a few pieces of that puzzle. Certainly interest rates are one part of it, but there's also some other work that we have underway that sits outside of the housing portfolio, but obviously working very closely with colleagues on. We know that land is one of the big drivers of price of housing in New Zealand, so there's the work that David Parker has underway in terms of RMA reform and what will happen there. We also have the work that we're doing within the urban development part of the Kāinga Ora portfolio, which is around making sure that we've got the infrastructure right to have more dense housing, and certainly we can deliver more affordable housing there. And there's also the work that we've announced that we'll do next term in government as a Labour policy around a market study into building products.
Sure.
Because I think everybody's heard the stories about how much more expensive it is to buy building products in New Zealand than it is even across the Tasman in Australia. So There's a range of things. There's no magic fix. It's a systems approach.
But I guess the interest rates has a huge effect. When is the last time you've been briefed by the Reserve Bank on how its actions are impacting your portfolio?
So I don't get regular briefings from the Reserve Bank. Obviously that gets worked through my officials, through my housing officials, that I get briefings from them around how things like interest rates are impacting housing. One of the things since March this year, since COVID, that I've been getting very regular briefings on is what the state of the housing market has been, and certainly interest rates come into that, but construction. That one of the fears we had was that we'd see what happened post GFC, that we'd see a complete sort of stalling of construction, and that is not something that we can afford to have happen in New Zealand. That will lead to more undersupply.
Yes, yeah, and actually, right, that is a good segue into the next bit I wanted to talk about, which is this program that that you have announced in government. So it's not a policy, it's something that's happening. And that is basically that you'd like to broaden the underwrite. And this is the similar underwrite that you use for Kiwibuild. And the aim is basically to make it easier for developers to secure finance at a time where banks are possibly being more cautious with their lending. So the underwrite means that this would see taxpayers buy a property below market value if a developer can't sell it. And the criteria that says what criteria developers would need to meet to qualify for this underwrite is still being written. Can you detail for us any more around what that criteria might look like?
Look, and as you've identified, that's work we've currently got underway. We've been working really closely with the construction sector in terms of how we arrived at this policy. I think the real worth of this policy is actually that the underwrite exists. That what we heard very clearly from developers that after lockdown, that banks became very risk adverse, looking for up to 100% pre-sales on some developments, which just meant we were not going to get those housing developments underway. This allows developers to get on with it because they can go to the bank and say, we do have a government underwrite. That effectively means 100% pre-sale. But what we're also seeing on the other side of that is we are seeing strong sales. So really the bit that was in danger of stalling it was the ability for finance and for developers to get that financing. So that's really the whole purpose of it. Obviously, we want this aligned with government policy objectives, the kinds of housing objectives that we are trying to achieve as a country. But it is twofold. It's trying to avoid what we saw post-GFC, where we saw construction fall away and all the jobs that cascade away with that. We're talking tens of thousands of jobs. And that it's really important that we keep this market going. We need houses, we need people working in the jobs, building them, and we need to be training people to take up those jobs.
Okay, so could those, in terms of the houses being aligned with the government's goals, does that mean you'd underwrite sort of higher density housing or lower cost housing? Like, would you underwrite a development of lifestyle blocks?
Look, as we've identified, we're still working up the criteria around that. What we will want to see is that developments do have affordable housing as part of the development that's taking place. What we know is the safest part of the market and where the banks will lend is those larger houses on larger sections. They see the riskier part of the market as the higher density, and that's certainly the bit of the market we want to see continue because it is really important. It's where we saw affordable housing fall away when the market was just left to cope with the GFC, and we do not want to see a repeat of that.
Okay, the risk is that the taxpayer basically underwrites the dodgy developments or the ones that banks see as high risk, perhaps for good reason. I mean, not always for good reason, but there could be instances where they think it for good reason, and then the taxpayer steps in. What can be done to mitigate that?
Well, there's several things that can be done to mitigate it. One, we're not seeing demand falling away. What we're seeing is lending changing and lending patterns by bank. But what we are seeing is very strong house sales. And we know that there are strong sales at that affordable end of the market. It's a different area for banks. So I don't accept that characterisation as the kind of the dodgy developments. I think they're the kinds of developments that we continue to see. And look, what we know is that these houses will sell. It may take a little bit longer than a developer needs to get on with building their next development to keep supply coming in, but they will sell. We are not going to lose money on housing.
Okay, we'll turn to Kiwibuild now. Obviously, this has been tweaked on a number of occasions, largely to broaden the criteria, so to increase demand and also tweak some of the way that the risk is being shared between the taxpayer and the developer. Are you looking to make any further criteria changes to Kiwibuild?
I think we've done quite a lot already to tweak who's eligible. I'm not imagining any further at the moment, but that said, we continue to monitor and we will have continuous improvement as required.
Okay, the public housing waitlist is at near about 20,000. If you were re-elected, would you perhaps shift your focus from first home buyers to people in need of public housing, or will you keep the focus the way it's kind of balanced between some of these different areas of need?
Look, there is absolutely no need to shift focus. That we've had a very strong focus on provision of public housing in our first term, as well as getting Kiwibuild and home ownership products up and running. That you only need to look at our record to see that we're building more state houses than any government has in a generation since the 1970s. That we've delivered 5,670 public houses. And we saw this year's budget deliver a commitment for a further 8,000 houses, which will bring public housing provided by our government by 2024 to over 18,000 homes. And that's something I'm immensely proud of.
Supply is obviously the issue, as well as some of these other things we talked about, like interest rates and demand and so on. But something that this government has actually quietly spent a lot of time doing is setting up the housing agency Kāinga Order and giving it the powers to do large-scale public or private led developments and enabling those developments to go through a streamlined consenting process. We haven't actually heard whether there are any projects definitely committed to going through this new consenting process. I'm not sure if you can talk us through whether there are in fact projects in the pipeline.
This sits in the urban development part of the portfolio rather than the housing bit, but certainly something closely connected to with Minister Twyford. But these are things we're going to start bearing fruits of.
Finally, bank lending growth against investor residential property has overtaken lending growth against owner-occupier residential property. I don't know if you have any thoughts on the Reserve Bank's decision to remove LVR restrictions. And from the time they removed these restrictions, which are put on bank lending, we've seen that investor part of the market shoot up. What are your thoughts on that decision by the RBNZ?
Look, and it's something that we continue to discuss with banks as well, and certainly something that I discuss with Minister Robertson in his role as Finance Minister, that we do want to make sure that we are working with the banking sector to see what some of the supports that government supports that sit around, particularly first home buyers, how this can impact on their ability to lend to first home buyers and the kinds of deposits that people might have to take to the table. Some of the work we're doing around progressive home ownership certainly falls within that bucket.
Look forward to seeing what happens in that space, because that's another one that's been a bit slow to get off the ground in terms of rent to buy and those sorts of schemes.
Oh, I don't accept that for a moment. We announced that 18 months ago. We're going to have the first people moving into their homes under our progressive home ownership scheme in November this year. Bear in mind that progressive home ownership isn't just going and looking at an open home and purchasing the home the next week. There's often a lot of intense work that needs to happen with agencies to get people paid off debt, to get into an ability for banks to lend to them. This is stuff that takes time, and I think the fact we've got our first families moving in November is a really great achievement.
Okay. Megan Woods, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. And I'm Janae Tipsarani from interest.co.nz.